Alright, so let's move on to a very important topic called microevolution. We want to see how there's change within a species. Alright, we'll start here with microevolution. Alright, the change within a species. When there's pressure on a species and there's change at the genetic level that causes the makeup to differ, we call that microevolution. There's changes of the traits at a species level. Right, we're talking at a species level. So those, for example, those changes that lead to varieties of different apples. All right, it might be climatic shift. All right, it might be nutrient changes in nutrient levels. It might be because of change in animals that are eating the apples. All right. So that would be an example of microevolution, the changes that lead to the variety of different apples, different colors of a bird. Okay, any change at the species level that's due to putting a pressure on it. We're going to call that a selective pressure. All right, so how these adaptations become part of the genetic material for future generations of that species. That's what we're talking about with microevolution. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. My example here is grass. All right, so we're going to be looking at the alleles, and I know that you all love and use alleles all the time. You're going to need to remember a little bit of genetics here, so hopefully some of this makes sense, and if it doesn't, just come and talk to me and we can go through this. But here we go. Let's take a look at grass and how microevolution works. So I'm going to go ahead and draw an allele here. So let's say, all right, we're going to be looking at the genotypes and the phenotypes. All right, the phenotypes is going to be the outward expression. In this case, we're going to have tall grass and we'll have short grass. All right, that's the outward expression. The tall grass is going to be the dominant gene, and the short grass, the small t, will be the recessive. And then we're also going to look at the genotype, the actual allele. And here we go. Let's say we have heterozygous parents. All right, where you have this is an example of grass seed. There you go. All right, so you have heterozygous parents, and what's going to happen with this generation? You're going to have tall, 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 short, tall, short. So with this series of this first generation of grass seed, we see we have 75% tall grass and 25% short grass. Okay, because you have tall, 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 short, so the dominant gene is going to dominate in 75% of the grass seed. 75% of your grass is going to be tall. All right, so now that's good because tall is better competitively. All right, it gets more sunlight. So tall is the adaptation that benefits the plant the most. So the shorts are going to die out. All right, it doesn't get enough light. The short is going to die out. Let's see what happens if we add a selective pressure. All right, let's say we have a change in the environment, and our change in the environment is going to be a grazing animal. All right, we have a grazing animal. Let's say we have a cow in a field that is now going to become the selective pressure here. All right, so where tall used to be the advantage, now the cow, it's easier to get to. The cow doesn't have to bend as far. It's going to eat the tall grass first. So let's see what happens. All right, we'll draw another Punnett square, and I'll just fill these in so you see what's going on here. So now all of a sudden, because you have a grazing animal and it's easier to get to the tall grass, it's going to be the short grass that's going to end up surviving. So now what was once a benefit, being tall, is now a negative. And being short is the positive. So those are going to be the ones that survive to reproduce. All right, so let's take another generation here and see what happens. Now we have homozygous parents here, and instead of heterozygous, so let's see what happens. Okay, so now if you take a look here, we have, from adding a selective pressure to this environment and having short be an advantage, you now have 50% short and 50% tall. All right. And if we continue this process with the grazing animal, the tall ones are going to be the ones to die out. The short ones are going to be the ones left behind to reproduce. So let's go one last generation here. Okay, the talls are going to phase themselves out, and here you go. You are going to end up with 100% short grass. Alright, so now this is simplified beyond belief, but hopefully you get a sense, using this grass example, that adding a selective pressure, in this case a grazing animal, alright, what was once the advantage to be tall because it gets more light, you have a selective pressure to the environment, a grazing animal, and now through a couple of generations in this case, it is now beneficial to be short, and those are going to be the grass left to reproduce, and you have a phasing out of the tall, and now you see how this plant can evolve through microevolution to have a change in its genetic makeup. We do this all the time. Alright, we use microevolution in our plants and in our food. Okay, this is very beneficial for humans to use this. So hopefully you get a sense of what's going on here. And like I said, if you don't, I can go through this again with you in a different way. Just keep me in touch. But let me give you another example. Alright, here's a famous example of the water flea. Alright, so now I had to put this sideways just because it's easier to see here. This is an example where there's an adaptation of a species that got smaller because of a selective pressure. And the selective pressure is the fish. Alright, so here you go. You have this fish is going to feed on the water flea. That's the selective pressure. So here you go in the first generation of water flea. You have two parents that are somewhat big, and when they breed, you're going to have 75% big, and then the one genetic abnormality, one comes out small. But guess what? The fish, as it swims through the water, is going to want the big ones. They're easier to see, it's more food, so they're going to eat the bigger ones. And the ones that are left behind is going to be that one genetic anomaly, the smaller one. And that's going to be left behind to reproduce in the next generation. So now you have heterozygous parents, one big, one small, and they reproduce, and you're going to have more smaller ones come out in the next generation. Again, the selective pressure is the fish. It wants the bigger water flea, so there's going to be more smaller ones left behind to reproduce for the next generation, the third generation. So now you can see through this selective pressure, it's an advantage to be small. So the smaller ones survive, and the larger ones phase out of the gene pool, and you're left over here with 100% smaller water fleas. So that's an example of how prey, or something at the primary consumer level, would evolve pretty quickly in some cases to get smaller. Right, so that's another example. Okay. Alright, let's take a look at the ways in which microevolution can be obtained. Okay, the first one is what we all think of when we think of microevolution. The first one is mutation. It's where a mutation becomes the advantage for the species. Okay, so now you got to understand that when we hear mutation, it's true that those are usually negative. Right? Most mutations are fatal, okay, but a small percentage of them can actually be beneficial. And then it would become part of the genetic makeup. So for the example here in letter A, you have a mouse and there was a mutation, and for whatever reason that became an advantage. So the next generation, the black mouse survived. It continued to be in the gene pool. All right, it became part of the genetic makeup. That's a nice classic example there of mutation, as long as it becomes an advantage. Alright, most mutations are negative, but if it does become an advantage, it can find itself in the genetic makeup. Alright, the second type of microevolution is genetic drift. This is an interesting one. So you have a large population. Okay, so here you have a large population of mice. You have a large population of individuals and species, and for whatever reason, that population shrinks. So now you're down here, and particular traits phase out. For example, being black all of a sudden might not be beneficial anymore, or might not matter. Okay, so it's going to be the white mice that reproduce. So the black mouse is going to phase out. All right, it's going to drift out of the gene pool. So it's in a case where it doesn't become an advantage and white is the advantage, it'll get phased out. All right, so right there, and it's just by chance, then genetic composition can change over time. So that's an example of genetic drift, and stay with me, I have examples of these. The third way that microevolution can occur is called the bottleneck effect. This one involves a catastrophe. So you have a large population, something happens where there's a catastrophe. That could be a flood, it can be a fire, it can be any type of catastrophe where a small population survives from the large population. So just by chance, whatever that small population is that survived, those are going to be the ones left behind to reproduce. So if you notice here in our large population, there's a lot of white mice. And there's some genetic mutations, and it honestly doesn't matter if it's beneficial to survive or not. Just by chance, those are the ones that survived. So in the next couple generations, that's going to be the genetic makeup. Alright, so now you have a new genetic makeup of species because of some type of catastrophe. And it's all by chance. Alright, the last one, the fourth way that microevolution can occur is called the founder effect. Alright, with the founder effect, we're dealing with a mainland and an island. On the mainland, you have a huge variety, lots of diversity in a gene pool. Somehow, some of them get over to the island. And it's going to be those that make it to the island that are going to reproduce. So those that survive on a remote island, there may be some by chance that have genetic differences, but again, those are going to be the ones that continue to reproduce, and now you get a different genetic makeup on that island. You can even have a new species. This is the only type of microevolution that can lead to what's called speciation, all right, where a new species occurs. Speciation. Which would make them an endemic species. They have found an ecological niche, they become an important part of the island, all right, and that's the founder effect. And again, that one is also just by chance. So those are the four ways microevolution can occur: mutation, genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, founder effect. A lot of those are by chance, but let's look at some examples here. Okay, you have the founder effect, and in this example, there was a storm, and it blew one of the red ladybugs over onto the island, and now that is the one that survived and was able to reproduce. So you have red ladybugs on the island. You don't have any yellow ones. Here's a bottleneck situation where you have a large population in the bottle. You have blues and yellows and greens and reds in the bottle. There's some type of catastrophe, all right, a hurricane or a huge storm or a flood, and the only ones that made it through are the blue and the yellow by chance. All right, so when there's a catastrophe and only certain species survive, you can lead to less diversity. Here's a nice example of the genetic drift. Okay, you have certain members whose traits are not so well suited for survival or reproduction. So the brown frog in this case, for some reason, brown isn't good for survival or reproduction. And you end up with that species, that trait, phasing out. It just literally dies out. And through that change, there's a new population of only green frogs. Alright, so these are a couple of examples of microevolution, and hopefully that makes sense to you. And honestly, if you do have questions or if you're a little confused about these, please bring your questions to class so that we can talk about them in person.